I was hoping for an exciting finale to the European Team Championship, as Hungary could still catch Russia if they beat them in the final round, but that match ended in 4 draws, somewhat disappointing. So that meant that Russia were convincing victors of the event with 15 points. Then there were 3 teams in joint second position, Armenia, Hungary and France, all on 13. So anyway, for my final game of the day from the European Team Championship, I'd like to look at the world champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, he didn't start the event very well, we've seen that. He has half out of 3. Then he beat Leko. You can see my report from a few days ago on that game. And then he had a few draws, not so great. But in the final round, he faced quite a stern test. Norway played Poland, and Carlsen played the Polish number 1, Radoslav Wojtaszek. Now, he's a top 20 player, very decent. In fact, he defeated Magnus Carlsen in the Vikings A tournament in January 2015. So let's see how Magnus got on against strong opposition. Carlsen with the white pieces. And he played this move, Bishop F4, that he used a lot a few weeks ago in the World Rapid and World Blitz Championships in Berlin. It's a kind of anti-theory move. You know, that it could transpose to a London system, but for example, after d6 and g6 by black, but it's pretty innocuous. But the idea is to get Wojtaszek out of his preparation. Wojtaszek worked for many years as a second to Vishy Anand, and his openings are excellent. So that's a way of getting Wojtaszek to think for himself. So we have a fairly standard position now on the board. It's almost a kind of Slav reverse, but now we transpose to another kind of opening. This is actually a Caro-Kann exchange variation. Let me go back to move 1. You can see here, this is the exchange variation, and now bishop d3 and c3. The pawn structure is exactly the same. Pieces are slightly differently placed, but it's basically the same kind of position. But in this case, it should be more favourable for black because he's able to claim this important diagonal with the bishop. There are also great similarities with the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, actually. So with the early development of the bishop, white tries to exploit that by playing queen b3, hitting the b pawn. That was defended, knight f3, and now actually Carlsen had exactly this position against the German player Dennis Wagner in the World Rapids. Wagner now played h6 to give that bishop a square. I actually looked at this game as well in one of my YouTube reports. You can see that elsewhere. Carlsen won a brilliant strategic game. But Wojtaszek very quickly played e6. He'd obviously been anticipating this line. So Carlsen thought, great, I'll try and grab the 2 bishops. Bishop e4. And Carlsen took this. One could play pawn takes here. But that kind of non-standard structure is perhaps not to Wojtaszek's taste. He's quite an orthodox player. So knight e4, and the knight has done its duty and returns to the centre. Bishop d6 from Wojtaszek, excellent move. He wants to trade off one of these bishops. That's good strategy. Also, it brings the knight to a very good central square, looking at some really important squares. But Carlsen can be happy that he now has a very nice bishop. And now here, I thought that simply castles is perfectly acceptable for black, followed by the standard minority attack. But Wojtaszek wanted to castle queenside. Now this definitely makes the game more double-edged with kings on opposite sides of the board. So let's see how things developed. This next phase of the game was, well, very subtle indeed. Well, this bit isn't. A4. Okay, this could start some kind of standard attack on the queen side. In fact, one could sacrifice a pawn here. This kind of thing is seen very often in the Queen's Gambit, and now just doubling on the A file. Decent compensation, but Magnus prefers to play in a different way, more strategic. Rook e1, of course the rook stands well on the open file. Rook c8, threatening knight b4, so the queen just nudges back. And rook e8. This phase of the game is very interesting. It's as though Carlsen is just waiting to see how black is going to commit himself. He could lunge forward with his b-pawn on this turn and over the next few moves, but instead he prefers to wait. Bishop f1. Well, this is kind of directed against e5 because, of course, the d-pawn would be vulnerable in that case. Black also waits around for a bit. He could play f6 here and maybe go for e5. He could also advance on the king side with g5. So Wojtaszek also is waiting around for the moment. Rook c1, well, the c-file could open at some stage with c4. Sometimes you advance the b-pawn and it's nice to have the c-pawn protected, but it's kind of a waiting move. Again, black could commit his pawns on the king side, but nope, he's waiting. So Wojtaszek begins the process of defending this pawn in order to break with e5, but he's still waiting. And this is a very intriguing move. Rook e2. If a weaker player had played this move, I'd be going, ugh, looks really ugly, blocking the bishop. But as we'll see, there is method in Magnus's madness. Knight e4 played. Now that the knight has moved away from controlling c4, Magnus felt the time was right to play b4. Now Wojtaszek played knight g5. I think this manoeuvre with knight e4 to g5 is somewhat misguided. If white exchanges, then that's a very favourable pawn structure for black. Possibilities to attack on the king side and more pawns in the centre. But Magnus played knight e1. Now we can see one of the points to playing rook e2. If black advances in the centre, then we're going to get a very double-edged situation where white is attacking on the queen side and black has some attack on the king side in the centre. But I think white's attack is actually more dangerous here. This knight is in a superb position. So I know it looks slightly awkward for white at the moment. His pieces, well, most of them are on the back rank, and this rook is kind of blocking. But this is quite a serious manoeuvre. So Wojtaszek decided to break open the position straight away. But now his knights get pushed to not very good squares. And I think it's interesting, you can see the knights kind of on the edges of the board. And this bishop does a really good job of protecting white's king. And you'll notice that Carlsen hasn't moved any of these pawns. So there are no weaknesses in white's king position. c4, that's an important move. So all white's pieces on the back rank, but actually they're about to fly out. And, well, obviously there's a pin on the d file. And if that pawn is advanced, then that gets blockaded very easily, and white has a nice majority on the queen side. Knight e6. Now white's pieces start to fly out. Knight f3. If queen e4, protecting this pawn, then c5. And white has a very nice attacking position. I really didn't like this queenside castling from black. His king lacks pawn protection, and I think we can see in this position that white's attack is building very nicely. I think the king should have been on g8, but maybe that's said with a great deal of hindsight. Wojtaszek played queen f4. Magnus took, and now we have an exchange of rooks. But this has left Carlsen's queen in this really dominating position in the middle of the board, and black is in huge trouble here already. G3, good move. Giving the king an escape square, but also preparing to bring the bishop into the game. Queen c5, of course, white avoids an exchange of queens. If queen c7, then queen e8, you can't block with the queen because of queen takes pawn, and after knight d8, knight e5, white is really taking the initiative. Something similar happened in the game. After queen f8, knight e5 hitting that pawn. You can see that white is just dominating now. And now there's a problem. f7 is under attack from these pieces, but there is also a threat to play queen takes knight and knight d7 forking. So king c7 and white wins a pawn. So, well, sorry, white doesn't win a pawn. Black can take back here. This is what happened, but actually now black's king gets cut to shreds. If the king steps back, then the bishop comes out. And the king stepped forward, but now knight d6, there's a fatal attack on the king. And knight e8 was a really nice winning move, threatening queen c7 mate, and there simply is no good defense. For example, queen f7, queen d6 will do the job. Yeah, it's gone. So, in the end, a convincing victory in the final round for Carlsen. I really liked that middle phase of the game where he was kind of playing cat and mouse with Wojtaszek, and finally Wojtaszek committed at the wrong moment. So at the end, Carlsen finished with 50%, 3.5 out of 7. Not a great result by him, but he did recover at the end, and I have no doubt that we'll be seeing a different Magnus when he comes to play in the London Chess Classic at the beginning of December, starting in less than 2 weeks' time. Do catch my reports for that one. Thanks for watching.